But yeah, let's do it. Welcome everyone. This is probably like our 20th meetup. It's the LogRocket meetup. Basically, we take a blog post and turn it into real life because the people writing all of our awesome blog content are real. Welcome. So today we've got why to use Next.js with Apollo. I've been using Next a ton recently. I'm a bit of a noob with Apollo, so I'm personally very excited. We're gonna just, I think, pretty high level go through some of the typical ways to be using Apollo with Next. We're joined by Connor, who's written a bunch of awesome articles for LogRocket. Before I pass it over to him, quick shout out: this meetup is brought to you by LogRocket. And if you've never heard of the solution before, it's a front-end performance monitoring tool. It helps you identify issues in your applications and your websites and your mobile apps a lot more quickly, and you can be more proactive about issues. So rather than just waiting for someone to report it or you find it by accident, LogRocket automatically surfaces issues, and that includes like UX issues and bugs like exceptions or failed network requests, slow network requests. Automatically, surfaces them to you, alerts you of them, so you can fix your applications more quickly. We're actually like looking at the issues view, you can go see like I've got a 400 network error here. I can go say that's a high impact. And how do you know it's a high impact? You actually go into that issue, and it's gonna load really fast for me because it always does. Oh yes. But when that works, this is a sandbox I'm working on, which is getting slapped together. Basically, from that view, you can go click the issue and go see the actual sessions affected by that issue. So you can then go make the determination, that 400 patch issue was actually really important because, like IKEA, for instance, we were looking at, that prevented someone from filling out a form, and you can actually see this is the redacted session replay because we don't want any kind of PII leaking through. Here's that failed network request here. It makes debugging a lot more quick, your life a lot more easy. So that's it. That's all I got. Connor, take it away. If anyone has any questions, leave them in the chat, and I will get to them. I want to interrupt Connor, but if I have to, maybe at the end, we'll get to them. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you for that. Do you need me to give me a quick intro of myself, or? Sure,
that'd be great.
Yeah, cool. So can you quickly see my screen just so I don't have to ask you again in a minute? Yep, cool. So hi, I'm Connor, soon to be full stack, currently just a front end dev, but soon to be a full stack dev, working with TypeScript mainly, a bit of AWS now, Next.js a lot. So that's it, kind of what I do that, and then do a lot of content creation on Twitter and YouTube, and do, as Luke mentioned there, quite a lot of articles for LogRocket and a few other people, but because we're on a LogRocket call, we won't mention that. So yeah, mainly do articles for LogRocket. So today Luke asked me wonderfully to do, sorry, I'm not wearing my LogRocket swag you sent me, I should have put that on. So you asked me to do one of these meetups, and I thought, why not? So let's go for it. So the article in question, I should have got it up really, as a link at the end of this presentation, and then we'll jump into the code. But this is based on an article I did about a month and a bit ago on why to use Apollo client with Next.js. So let's kind of get started. So kind of what we're going to cover in this very quick presentation, literally like 5-10 minutes, if that, is quick overview of what Apollo client is, in case you don't know, and same with Next.js, in case you don't know, why we should be using the Apollo client with Next.js, Next.js rendering methods, and then how the Apollo client handles that. That's going to be kind of a very high level introduction. And then we're going to jump into a project I made for it, which is just a Next.js project showing you some historic data for SpaceX. So we'll jump into that after the presentation, just to look at the code and see how the different rendering methods work, which is the code walkthrough there. And then just finishing up further info, and then I guess questions, and if there are any, we'll go from there. So starting kind of overview of Apollo client and Next.js. So Apollo client themselves, they kind of describe themselves as a comprehensive state management library for JavaScript that enables you to manage both local and remote data with GraphQL. In most cases, I've used it. You have a GraphQL API running on a server somewhere, and this is just the way you interact with that data, querying the data in, running mutations, and just kind of, every bit of communication between your application on the front end and this backend GraphQL API goes through Apollo. It does many amazing things, which we'll look at in a moment when we cover kind of why use Apollo. But for Next.js, it's a React framework. And I actually found this cool description on their website, which is puts you and your team in the pit of success when building React applications. I didn't write that, they did. But yeah, Next.js has many amazing things in it. They do like API routes for you automatically on your, for like serverless functions to interact with kind of backend APIs and stuff more securely. They do page-based routing, in case you don't know, sorry, I'm reading this on my notes here because I couldn't remember all of this, automatic image optimizations, and they do like zero config for compiling and bundling things together. And it's just an amazing framework, and highly recommend you go use it if you haven't used it before, because it's their documentation and tutorials are amazing as well. Cool. Moving on. So why use Apollo Client? There's 3 key reasons I outlined in the article. There are presumably a lot more as well, because Apollo is an amazing tool to use. So the first one is their out-of-the-box support for caching. They actually go as far as calling this zero config. And when we walk through the code in a minute, you'll see it is essentially zero config. You literally just create a file, and it's about, like, off the top of my head, it's like 10 lines of code. And then that's it. Your Apollo client set up with caching built in. It is pretty amazing. Then the loading and error states. So if anyone's worked with kind of handling requests to APIs in the past, you have to deal with, is it loading? Are we waiting for the response to come back? What happens if there's an error? What happens if there's a success? All of this kind of stuff we have to handle when dealing with an API. Well, Apollo has all of that built in through their use query hook. So on the client side, as we'll see in a moment, and when we walk through the code, you can use their use query hook, and you can just destructure out from this hook the data, the error, and the loading states. They automatically update as the request is taking place. So loading will be true when you are waiting. Obviously, error will be true if there's an error, and then you get your data at the end, which you can await on. It is a truly amazing hook, and it just saves so much time. And then that leads into kind of the final point, which I've got outlined here, is the declarative approach to data fetching. So we just declare to Apollo client, if, for an example, we want to tell it we want field 1, 2, and 3. We haven't got to tell it how to get field 1, 2, and 3. We tell it we want it, it goes and gets it and brings it back to us. We don't have to kind of worry about the steps in the middle. It's more just kind of outlining what we want, not an ABC of how to go get those things, which is pretty cool. So the 3 main Next.js rendering methods that we'll be looking at in this kind of walkthrough today is the static site generation, or SSG, using the get static props function, which will export from the page. Server-side rendering, which uses the get server-side props function in Next.js. So both of those will be using kind of the inbuilt Next.js functions to handle the data fetching and all of the querying from Apollo to the backend or to the API will be happening on the server side in those functions when Next.js builds the pages either on server-side rendering or ahead of time for the build for static site. When we are getting to using the use query hook for the Apollo client is on the client side, and that's a little bit more involved to set up, but we'll walk through that as well, which is actually the next thing. So let me drag across my code editor. So I don't have it up. I should have put it on it. But if you want to install Apollo, it's really easy. You just run npm install Apollo GraphQL and GQL, and that's it. It's installed. So the first thing you want to do when you install the Apollo client is, where is it? I can't find it again down in my head. There's the config. The config. Not that one. Sorry, I am losing the plot today. I've opened up. Oh, that's funny. I opened up the wrong file. Oh, you can prepare. I thought I had the right one open. You can prepare as much as you want and you still make a mistake. Apologies. I had the right directory open. That's why I couldn't find it. There it is, Apollo client. So this is what I was talking about with the file for caching. So when you want to set up the Apollo client after you've installed it, which, as I said, is they go at Apollo client to install. When you've got it in here, you outline these 8 lines, and essentially we're saying the API that we want to hit. If I went to this API in the browser, it's just a GraphQL kind of a graphical interface that we can use to interface with the GraphQL API. So this is what we'll be querying. So you set that up by putting in the URL, and literally to set up caching with Apollo is just this one line here. So they're not joking when they say, oh, sorry, I have my, there you go. There you go. Sorry, my apologies. I have my code zoomed out quite a bit. But yeah, so to set up the caching is just this one line here. So when they said it's a 0 config for caching, they really aren't joking about that. So yeah, that's the setup of Apollo there, as well as the caching. So now let's have a look at our SSG or static site generation for this. So we pull in our client here, as well as our GQL, which is the thing we install alongside Apollo. And then, as you can see here, there's no fetching done actually on the page itself. It's all done down here in the get static props function. So in the get static props, we use the client, which we created in that file there, which we just went through. And then we use the query method on it to run this query, which, well, let me execute it in this. There you go. So that's the, this data is quite outdated. I know SpaceX have done launches since then, but for the purposes of this tutorial, obviously it worked okay, but I wouldn't be using this for kind of any real live data. But essentially, this will be the data it fetches for us in here. And then throughout here, then we just return this to the page using the props, and we destructure out of sorry, let me get my words out. So we return the prop next launch to the page by returning the property launch next from data. So that's just destructuring out here. We get the data and launch next there. So that gets returned to the page, which is here. And then we just destructure out the information to display it to the page. And then that gives us this page. So if I just move that to the side, you'll see, obviously that's just the stuff in the head there, but then we get our next SpaceX launch, which definitely isn't the next SpaceX launch, but the principle's there. The mission name, which is the one, which is the CRS-21. And if we look in here, it's the CRS-21 on the 6th of the 11th, 2020, not 2022, and launched from the Kennedy Space Center, which all matches this API, be it a bit outdated. So that's the server-side rendering side of things with Next.js. It's a very similar story. Sorry, static site generation, that was. It's a very similar story with server-side rendering. Instead of using the get static props function, which we defined in here, the only difference is that we use the get server-side props function instead. Other than that, this is a completely identical file pretty much in every way. I think it is. Yeah, it is identical in every other way. It is just using the get server-side props. So instead of generating a build time, it's generated on request from the client. So in theory, if this was changing, you could change this. If this data was changing, and updating on request, you'd get new information. Obviously, in this case, the data is quite outdated, so you would go for a static site like this. But in a case where the data is changing, you would prefer to go with a server-side query. You could also, it's worth mentioning and throwing in here, I haven't included it in here, and I haven't included it in the article either, but Next can do deferred or incremental rendering or incremental updates to the static. So I can't remember, I think it's, yeah, ISR, incremental static rendering. That's it. And essentially, to do that, you use is it a validate prop? Revalidate down here. And essentially, sorry, let me just get a drink. My throat's getting really dry from talking. You can tell I haven't done one of these before. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. But yeah, so we include a revalidate prop. So then when we render this every so often, it might be like every 10 requests, it refetches the data and it incrementally updates it. And so I didn't include that in this, but that is something you can also do. So the final rendering method that we need to look at is the client side rendering method. So the page, as you can see, looks completely different. Well, not completely different, but it looks different to the static side. So we don't export, we don't have a get static props or a get server side props function because client side doesn't need that. So what we do instead is we destructure out the queries, which is where the use query prop comes in to this component. So we have two components that we need to use. One of these, this client only one. It's worth putting out here. It's was included in the article. I won't go into the story there, but this, and it's now going to be put back into the article. But this component was created by Josh Cormu. Sorry, I'm going to butcher his name. Josh Cormu. That's the author of this component. So essentially, this component will only run on the client, not on the server. So because we're running this this past launches component and we're running use query, let's get them up alongside each other so we can see them. We don't want to run this when we're not in the browser, because obviously Next.js runs on the server when it builds everything. So we don't want to use this hook when we're not in the browser. And that's what this hook does. This hook essentially just checks, has the component mounted to the page or not? If it has, then we can run this, we can pass the children and we can run. If not, we return null. That's all this component does. And that's why we wrap it here. So then this will only run on the browser. Otherwise it returns null. That's this. Like I said, that's made by Josh Cormu. I'm so sorry if I've got his name wrong. I know I have. Not by myself. So now let's have a look at the past launches component, which is actually kind of where the magic happens for the client side, if I can split screen up. So at the top here, we bring in use query, which is the hook from Apollo client we want to use, along with GQL, which lets us define the GraphQL. We then define our query. So in this case, we're going for past launches, not the next launch. So if I run that in our little browser here, just full screen that. So you can see we get the next 10 launches, again, all outdated information, but for the purposes of this, it's fine. But it's the next 10 launches, and that's what we want to display. So that's our query. And this is what I was talking about before with the declarative approach. So we use the data, loading, and error. And all we do is we give the use query hook our query, which is what was defined here. We give it that, and that's it. It does everything else for us. We haven't got to worry about anything else. It sorts it all out for us. All it does for us is give us the data, which we use down here. A loading Boolean, so true or false for whether it's waiting for the data to come back. And then the error if an error has occurred. We then use these two Booleans to control our rendering here. So if we're loading, we just show loading data. And if there's an error, we just show, sorry, there's been an error. So we can see that in action if I load up the page. Oh, I got stuff running. I did have it running because I had to open up the code editor by mistake. I should have restarted it. Now this should work. There you go. So you can see there the loading data coming up. There you go. I'm not actually sure. I might be able to force it to make an error if I like botch one of the query parameters. Hopefully we can trick it into giving, yeah, see, sorry, there's been an error. And that's kind of one of the beauties of the Apollo client there is all we need to do is give the use query hook a query and it handles everything else for us in terms of handling the requests and bringing it back. All we have to do is just handle the displaying of that. We don't have to worry about intercepting kind of the payload when or the response when it comes back from the data and being like, is this an error code? Is it not? Apollo does all of that for us. So now it's literally just a case displaying this data out on the page by destructuring out the query field from the query, and then mapping and then taking those values and displaying them on the page. I did just remember there's one thing which did slip my mind by looking at my notes to the right. With client-side rendering, the only thing you have to do otherwise is you have to wrap every page in the Apollo provider. That gives you access to the use query hook. My mistake, I should have mentioned that earlier. It just come back to me. But yeah, that is it. So once you've wrapped it, give the client to the Apollo provider. You can then use this use query hook in any component. You could use obviously on the pages as well. Data loading an error, and then that controls your output. So then that gives us the free pages. So our client-side rendering, which would just show the error state as well. The server-side rendering, which is, this is going to look very identical. I probably should have done this in different, but you can see there's a bit of a flash there. And then SSG. Not SSG, sorry, I've got it on the home root, not SSG. There you go. So that's our free pages from it. We have our static site, just using get static props like this. We have our server side using get server side props. Like I said, the only difference between those two is one uses get server side props, one uses get static props. That is the difference there. And then we just return in both cases of this, the props to the page, destructure it, display it, very similar to how you would for pretty much any other kind of data fetching server in Next.js. If static side, you would bring it in here and then return it props to the page. Very similar. We were just using the query and client and .query for both for static side, static state generation and server side rendering. And then on the client side, just to recap, we wrap the page in the Apollo provider, which we import and give our client, which we configured first in this file, which also gives us the caching. Then we have this client only component, which again, as I said before, I didn't write this. This is Josh Cormu. And we wrap all of our components that have these queries inside of them to check if it's mounted. If the component has mounted, then we can continue rendering the component and the queries within them and fetching the data. Otherwise, we just return null to avoid any errors of fetching data on the server side when it should be fetched on the client. And then the only other thing then is in our component, we have our query, pass it to the use query, returns us this free values, loading, which is just our loading state, error if there's been an error, and then the data, which we destructure out the values, pass to the page, and display. So that is a very high level kind of whiz-stop tour almost, probably a bit too whiz-top, my apologies for that, kind of getting adjusted to in the talks. But yeah, so that is a very high level overview of server-side rendering, both server-side rendering, static side generation, and client-side rendering on Next.js. So just to kind of very quickly finish up, this is the article I mentioned, which goes along with this. Go a lot more in depth in this, just kind of talking more, or not a lot more, but more in depth talking about the individual rendering methods, differences, how there's the command there to install it, walk through all of the code line by line, explaining it, so on. And then just down the bottom here, I've got the link to the GitHub, which this project's on if you want to go nosy it, and links to the Apollo client kind of documentation and introduction to it and a bit more about it. So that's kind of their kind of great recap of themselves. But yeah, again, apologies for my kind of getting a dry throat for this. Practice, I guess, needed.
No worries, you did great, man.
Thank you.
Anyone have any questions? I have one of just kind of put questions in the chat if you've got any. I guess like for people starting out with the Apollo client, like it just automatically handles caching with that one kind of config element in there. I know you can kind of customize how cache behaves like a lot more, like where you kind of how do you usually start messing around with that, or like how would you kind of recommend people start to kind of tinker around with like conditional caching and like clearing it and like all that stuff?
Yeah, so in my experience, I've mainly just relied on their kind of inbuilt kind of automatic caching. In my next few projects, I'm going to look more at caching because it's going to be more important than just kind of the automatic stuff. So like their documentation is going to come in like massively helpful for that. So that would kind of be my recommendation to go for that, because I don't really have any personal experience to rely on for that. But their documentation I know is worth its weight in gold and is pretty solid all around. So I'd recommend that.
Got any questions? Looks like no. So yeah, I'm going to send all these links around this recording. And yeah, oh, here we go. How would you manage mock data with Apollo client?
Oh, that is a good question. That is, I don't think I've actually needed to do that before, because all of the API, oh, my camera's just gone blurry. So all of the APIs I've kind of needed to work with have been live and working. I haven't actually had to deal with mock data before. But yeah, that is an interesting one to look into. I imagine their documentation, again, I'm going to keep deferring to that, but apologies, but I imagine their documentation definitely covers mock data and use cases for that if it's needed. But yeah, in my personal experience, I haven't had to do that. Sorry about that.
I think we might have actually covered that in a different meetup. So I'll send you that.
Yeah, if you could, because I'd be interested in checking that out as well. This is kind of very high level introduction to Apollo.
It was actually with your QL in Apollo. It was like, it wasn't with GraphQL, but the solution's pretty similar. So I'll send that to you. Cool. All right, that's all we got. Thanks a ton for joining, everyone. Thank you, Connor, and we'll see you on the next one.
No worries. Thank you for having me. Cheers.
Yeah.